What if the oldest list of kings ever discovered wasn't meant to record how long they lived, but something else entirely? What if we've been reading it wrong for over a century, mistaking memory for mythology when the truth was hidden in plain sight all along? In the climate-controlled basement of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, a small clay prism rests in archival storage. It's barely larger than a coffee mug. Its four sides covered in wedge-shaped marks that look almost like bird tracks pressed into dried mud. Museum staff handle it with cotton gloves. Researchers request special permission just to photograph it. This object, discovered over 100 years ago, is called the Sumerian King List, and it contains numbers that should not exist. Before we go further, if you enjoy mysteries where ancient documents refuse to make sense, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you're listening in the dark right now, somewhere in the world, drop a comment and tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is. I want to picture this story reaching across time zones while you drift towards sleep. The way these ancient words have drifted across millennia, waiting for someone to understand what they really mean. The discovery happened in the summer of 1906. An American archaeologist named Herman Hilprecht was leading excavations at Nippur, one of the holiest cities in ancient Sumer. His team had been digging for months, through collapsed temples and residential quarters, hauling baskets of broken pottery and clay fragments to sorting tables, where scholars tried to piece together the puzzle of Mesopotamia's forgotten past. Most of what they found was predictable: tax receipts, business contracts, letters between merchants arguing over grain prices, student exercises where young scribes practiced their wedge-shaped, writing over and over until their hands learned the muscle memory of pressing reed, styluses into wet clay. Then someone brushed the dirt from a small prism, and everything changed. The text began simply enough, with a line that sounded like poetry. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Hilprecht recognized the format immediately. This was a king list, the kind of chronological record that every ancient civilization kept. Egypt had lists of pharaohs stretching back through dynasties. Babylon would eventually compile its own royal chronologies. Even Rome, centuries later, would obsessively document which emperor ruled when. King lists were practical documents. They established legitimacy, settled disputes over succession, and helped scribes date legal contracts by saying something happened in the 5th year of King So-and-so's reign. They were supposed to be boring, reliable, factual, but the Sumerian version was different. Hilprecht began translating the cuneiform signs. The first king's name was Alu. The city was Eridu, and his reign length Hilprecht stopped. He checked his translation. Maybe he had misread a symbol. Maybe the scribe had made an error. But the signs were clear, pressed firmly into the clay with absolute confidence. Alulem had reigned for 28,800 years. 28,800 years. Hilprecht moved to the next entry. Alalga, the second king of Eridu, reign length 36,000 years. The third king, a man with the unpronounceable name Enluana, had ruled for 43,200 years. The list continued. 8 kings total in the city of Eridu, their combined reigns adding up to 241,200 years. Then the document moved to the next city, Bad Tibira, where 5 more kings ruled for a combined 108,000 years. Then Larak, where a single king reigned for 28,800 years. Then Sippar, then Shuruppak, and then, abruptly, The clay prisms, neat columns of numbers, were interrupted by a single devastating line. The flood swept over. Everything stopped. Everything ended. And then, after that break, after that caesura carved into clay, the text resumed with a phrase that would echo through every version of this document ever found. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. The word again hangs in that sentence like a weight, not lowered for the first time, but lowered again, as if kingship had descended once before, ruled through those impossible spans of years, and then been interrupted by water and catastrophe before being restored to a world that had to begin over. After that line, everything changed. The post-flood kings still had exaggerated reign lengths. Etana of Kish supposedly ruled for 1500 years, which is absurd, but it's the kind of absurdity you expect from ancient records. Great kings get their reigns inflated by legend. A ruler who governed for 50 years becomes 500 in the stories, told by his descendants. But 1500 years is at least comprehensible. It's human-scale mythology. 28,000 years is something else entirely. Hilprecht finished his translation and sat back, staring at the impossible numbers. He was a careful scholar, trained in the rigorous academic traditions of late 19th century philology. He knew that ancient scribes sometimes made mistakes. He knew that numbers could be corrupted through repeated copying. He knew that mythology often dressed itself up as history to seem more authoritative. But this document didn't feel like a mistake or a corruption or even a deliberate invention. It felt like something stranger, something deliberate. The numbers were too precise, too consistent, too carefully calculated to be random fabrications. And over the following decades, as more versions of the king list were discovered, that impression only deepened. Archaeologists found copies in Lhasa, in Ur, in Isin, in Babylon. Different scribes in different centuries, all preserving the exact same impossible numbers. And when scholars examined the tablets closely, when they looked at the tiny corrections where scribes had caught their own errors and fixed them, they realized something remarkable. These ancient copyists had treated this document with reverence. When they made mistakes, they crossed them out and rewrote the passage correctly. They weren't careless. They weren't indifferent. They copied these impossible reign lengths with the same careful precision they used for astronomical observations and mathematical calculations. They were preserving something they believed mattered. But what? What could those numbers possibly mean? Hilprecht and his contemporaries eventually settled on the simplest explanation. The pre-flood section must be pure mythology. Symbolic ages representing cosmic eras before human history properly began. The kind of origin story that every culture invents to make itself seem ancient and legitimate. Case closed. Mystery solved, except the Sumerians themselves never called it mythology. They cited those pre-flood kings in legal formulas and temple inscriptions as if they were historical precedents. They referenced the wisdom of Ululem's time and the laws established in the days of Enmenluana, as though these were real periods that had actually happened, not poetic inventions. And stranger still, when you hold one of these tablets, when you're allowed to lift it carefully from its archival foam and feel the weight of baked clay in your gloved hands, you can see something that makes the whole mystery even deeper. Fingerprints, not yours. The scribes, pressed into the wet clay 4,000 years ago before the tablet was fired. The whorls and ridges of a Babylonian scribe who lived during the reign of King Uanamu. who sat in a temple scriptorium and carefully copied this text from an earlier version, which had been copied from an even earlier version, stretching back through generations of transmission. That scribe didn't question the numbers. They didn't add a note saying these figures seem impossible. They simply copied faithfully, as though the document contained data that had to be preserved exactly, no matter how strange it seemed. 4,000 years later, those fingerprints reach across time like a bridge. Someone touched this clay. Someone believed these numbers meant something true. What did they know that we'd forgotten? The impossible kings wait in the darkness of archives. Their names pressed into clay, their reign lengths defying everything we think we understand about human history. And the question that haunted Hilprecht in 1906 still hangs in the air, unanswered. Why would generation after generation of scribes, people who calculated grain rations and predicted lunar eclipses with mathematical precision, copy numbers that were obviously, impossibly wrong? Unless those numbers weren't wrong at all. Unless we've been reading them wrong. For over 50 years after Hilprecht's discovery, the Sumerian king list sat in academic limbo. Scholars published translations. Museums displayed copies. University courses mentioned it as an interesting example of how ancient peoples mixed myth with history. But nobody could explain why the Sumerians had been so precise about numbers that were so obviously impossible. Then, in the 1960s, something shifted. A new generation of researchers began looking at those impossible reign lengths not as errors or fantasies, but as data. And when you approach impossible numbers as data, you start looking for patterns. And the Sumerian king list has a pattern so clear, so mathematically elegant, that once you see it, you can never read the document the same way again. Every single prefix reign length is a multiple of 3600. Every single one. The Sumerians had a special word for this number. They called it a shah. It appears in their astronomical texts, in their temple calculations, in cosmological inscriptions carved into stone meant to outlast empires. A shah was one of their fundamental units for measuring vast expanses of time, the way we might use decades or centuries or millennia. But a shah wasn't arbitrary. It was precisely 3,600 years. And when scholars started dividing those impossible reign lengths by 3,600, the king list transformed from nonsense into mathematics. Ululam, the first king of Eridu, had supposedly reigned for 28,800 years. Divide that by 3,600 and you get 8. 8 shahs, exactly. Alulgar, the second king, ruled for 36,000 years. That's 10 Shor Rs.N-Men-Lu-Anna, whose name means something like Lord of the Divine Powers of Heaven, reigned for 43,200 years. 12 Shor Rs.N-Men-Gale-Anna, another king with an elaborate title, ruled for 28,800 years. 8 shahs again. The pattern holds across every entry. Even the kings with slightly different numbers, the ones that don't hit the round shah counts quite as cleanly, are still clearly working within the same system. They're calculating something using multiples of 3,600 as the base unit. This is not poetic exaggeration. This is not mythology inflating human lifespans into cosmic ages. This is encoding. Someone was recording something using a specific mathematical system, and they were doing it with absolute precision, but encoding what? The question leads directly to what the Sumerians were famous for, what they excelled at beyond almost any other ancient civilization. Astronomy. The The Sumerians tracked the night sky with obsessive dedication. They recorded the movements of Venus across decades, noting when it appeared in the eastern sky before dawn, when it vanished behind the sun, when it emerged in the western sky after sunset. These observations required watching the same celestial patterns night after night, year after year, generation after generation, until the cycles became predictable, and Sumerian predictions were accurate. Terrifyingly accurate. Modern astronomers have checked their Venus tablets against computer models of historical planetary positions, and the Sumerian observations are correct too within a single day across 21-year cycles. You don't achieve that level of precision by casual stargazing. You achieve it through institutional commitment, through continuous observation maintained across lifetimes. The same precision shows up in their eclipse predictions. The Sumerians recognize what astronomers now call the Saros cycle, an 18-year period after which lunar eclipses repeat in very similar patterns. To identify this cycle, you need to observe and record eclipses for decades. Then compare your records to find the underlying rhythm. It's not something one person can discover in a lifetime. It requires institutional memory, and institutional memory requires institutions, observatories, schools, a system where knowledge gets passed from teacher to student, where records are maintained and compared across generations, where watching the sky isn't a hobby but a sacred responsibility. So here's the question that changes everything. What if those impossible reign lengths in the king list aren't recording how long individual kings lived? What if they're recording how long astronomical institutions operated? Think about it differently. Imagine the king list isn't saying Alulam. The man reigned for 28,800 years. Imagine it saying the Eridu Observatory operated for 8 complete Shah cycles. 8 periods of 3,600 years of continuous astronomical observation, from its founding in some unimaginably distant past until the flood destroyed it. Suddenly, the numbers stop being impossible. They become ambitious, yes. They become a staggering claim about the antiquity of organized skywalking. But they're no longer absurd. They're just really, really old. This reading explains why the king list uses Shahs as its unit. You don't measure human lifespans in 3,600-year increments, but you might measure the operational lifetime of an observatory that way, especially if your entire culture organized time around celestial cycles and you needed a unit that could express cosmic timescales. It explains why the Sumerians copied these numbers so faithfully. They weren't preserving biography. They were preserving chronology, the institutional memory of when sky watching began, how long it continued, and when catastrophe ended, and it explains the flood. The king list treats the flood as the moment when everything stopped. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, not when the first king died and the second king took over, but when an entire system collapsed and had to be rebuilt from scratch. If the pre-flood section records the operational life of astronomical observatories measuring time in Shahs, then the flood becomes the event that destroyed those institutions. The waters didn't just kill people and wreck buildings. They severed continuity. They ended a system of knowledge preservation that had been running for tens of thousands of years. And when the waters receded, when survivors emerged and started rebuilding, they had to begin again. Not from zero, because fragments survived. Stories survived. Some records survived. But the unbroken chain of institutional observation was shattered. The post-flood kings in the list start using different numbers because they're measuring different things. They're no longer recording Shah cycles of astronomical observation. They're recording actual human reigns, still exaggerated by legend, but recognizably human. The king list in this reading becomes a document about loss, about a world that existed before catastrophe, a world sophisticated enough to maintain continuous skywatching for periods of time so long that even the Sumerians, who themselves lived 5,000 years ago, could barely comprehend them. But this raises an even deeper question. If those 8 kings of Eridu represent 8 Shah cycles of observation, spanning 241,000 years before the flood, then who founded the Eridu Observatory? Who began counting? Who started this system of watching the heavens and recording what they saw, so long ago that the very idea strains against everything we think we know about human civilization? The Sumerians had names for those founders: Alulam, Alalga, Enmenluana. But were those the names of men? Or were they labels for eras? Titles given to periods of time by people trying to organize fragments of a shattered chronology? And if they were eras, what happened during those eras that was worth remembering across catastrophe? The clay tablets don't answer directly, but they hint. They whisper. In astronomical tables and in temple hymns and in creation myths that describe knowledge being given, not discovered, given by teachers who came from somewhere else. Teachers the Sumerians called by a name that appears on thousands of tablets, the Anunnaki. But before we can understand who the Anunnaki were, we need to understand what was lost. We need to see the evidence of the flood itself, the geological proof that the world really did end in water, and that everything the Sumerians knew was built on top of ruins. In the winter of 1929, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley stood at the bottom of a trench that had taken his team months to excavate. They were digging beneath the royal cemetery at Ur, one of ancient Sumer's greatest cities, hunting for the settlement's earliest occupation layers, the first modest homes, the first attempts at organized community, the archaeological beginning of urban civilization. His workers had been pulling up pottery fragments for weeks, pieces of simple bowls and storage jars, flint tools with edges still sharp enough to cut, charcoal from cooking fires that had burned 5,000 years ago, all the expected debris of early human habitation, layer after layer, going deeper and deeper into the earth. Then abruptly, the artifacts stopped. The workers hit clean clay, smooth, uniform, sterile. No pottery, no tools, no charcoal, no trace of human presence whatsoever. It looked like virgin soil, the natural earth that had existed before anyone built anything, before anyone lived anywhere near this place. Woolley assumed they had reached the bottom, the foundation layer beneath which nothing human existed. He was about to call the excavation complete and move his team to a different part of the city when something made him pause. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was thoroughness. Maybe it was just the stubbornness of someone who had spent years digging through Mesopotamian ruins and learned to question every assumption. He told his workers to keep digging, through the clean clay, through the sterile layer, down into what should have been nothing but natural geological deposits. They dug 2.5 meters, 8 feet of clay with no artifacts, no occupation debris, no sign that humans had ever existed. And then, at the bottom of that impossible thickness of sterile earth, the artifacts began again. Pottery, but different pottery. Not the style they had been finding above. Different shapes, different decorative patterns, different firing techniques. Flint tools, but worked in ways that didn't match the layers above. Charcoal, but from hearths built according to different architectural traditions. Beneath the flood layer lay another city, another culture, another world entirely. Something had buried it under 8 feet of water-deposited silt, something sudden and catastrophic enough to scour the landscape clean, leaving nothing but mud. And then, after the waters receded, after the clay dried and hardened, a new civilization had built directly on top of the remains. Woolley called the trench profile a sandwich of history. Human occupation, catastrophic flood, human occupation. The middle layer wasn't gradual sedimentation from centuries of seasonal river flooding. It was deposition from a single overwhelming event. Water moving with such volume and force that it transformed the landscape, buried everything, and left only silence. When Woolley published his findings, newspapers around the world ran headlines claiming he had found proof of Noah's flood. The biblical reference was dramatic, but the archaeology was sound. The flood layer actually dated to roughly 2,900 years before the Common Era, right around the time when the Sumerian king list describes kingship being lowered from heaven again after the waters swept over. The timing wasn't approximate. It was exact, but Ur wasn't the only site. Once Woolley's discovery became public, other archaeologists began checking their own excavations. At Shuruppak, the city where the Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra had supposedly ruled according to myth, they found the same sterile clay layer, roughly 2 meters thick, deposited between distinct occupation levels, a city, then water, then a different city built on top. At Kish, another major Sumerian center, the pattern repeated. Artifacts, flood, silt, artifacts. The same geological testimony of catastrophic inundation followed by rebuilding. At Eridu, the city where the king list claims kingship first descended from heaven, excavators uncovered evidence of abandonment and reconstruction following a major flooding event. The ancient temple complex showed signs of having been rebuilt on top of earlier foundations that had been damaged by water. Not every Sumerian site shows this layer. Some cities sat on higher ground that the waters never reached. Others were founded after the flood and carry no memory in their soil of what came before. But across the low-lying plains where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers converge, where ancient Sumer thrived in the fertile but vulnerable floodplain, the geological record is consistent. Around 2,900 years before the Common Era, something catastrophic happened. Water came. Not gradually, not seasonally, but suddenly and completely. The flood wasn't global. It didn't cover mountains. It didn't drown continents. But within the boundaries of Mesopotamian experience, within the world the Sumerians knew, it was total. Every city along the river valleys submerged, every field drowned, every settlement destroyed or abandoned, for people whose entire universe consisted of the land between 2 rivers, whose knowledge of geography extended perhaps a few hundred miles in any direction. The flood was the end of the world. Everything they knew disappeared beneath water. And when the waters finally receded, when the survivors emerged from wherever they had fled to higher ground or distant hills, they returned to find their world transformed, buried, erased. The clay layer tells a story that matches the king list almost perfectly. Before the flood, a culture existed. We can see their pottery, different in style from what came after. We can examine their tools, worked according to techniques that would be partially forgotten. We can study their architectural remains, showing sophistication that would have to be rebuilt from fragments. After the flood, the Sumerians, not a completely new people appearing from nowhere, but survivors and descendants rebuilding on top of ruins, preserving what they could, passing down stories, maintaining fragments of knowledge from the world before the waters. The 8 feet of sterile clay at your represents more than physical destruction. It represents the severing of continuity. Imagine what gets lost when a civilization stops for even a single generation. Libraries that don't get copied, teachers who die before passing on specialized knowledge, techniques that require apprenticeship and demonstration, records that exist only in a single archive. Now imagine that interruption lasting not one generation but several. Imagine the floodwaters standing for months or years before slowly draining away. Imagine the survivors scattered, traumatized, focused entirely on immediate survival rather than preserving abstract knowledge. The King lists pre-flood section with its astronomical observations, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, would have required continuous institutional operation, observatories where records were kept and compared, schools where calculation methods were taught, a stable civilization supporting specialists who could dedicate their lives to watching the sky. The flood destroyed that continuity, not necessarily the knowledge itself, because some of it clearly survived in fragmentary form, but the institutions, the unbroken chain of observation and record-keeping, the system. And when the Sumerians rebuilt, when they established new cities and new temples and new schools, they were working from fragments, trying to restore what had been lost, trying to remember what the world before the waters had known. That's why their texts keep using that word, restoration, not invention, not discovery, restoration of what was before. The clay doesn't lie. Beneath every Sumerian city where archaeologists have dug deep enough, the same story repeats: occupation, catastrophe, rebuilding, a world that ended in water, preserved only in geological layers and in tablets pressed by people who knew they were the last generation to carry direct memory of what had been lost. But if the Sumerians were restoring knowledge from before the flood, how did they know what to restore? How did mathematics and astronomy and medicine appear so quickly, so completely in their earliest layers? The answer lies in what they inherited, and who they inherited it from. Civilizations are supposed to stumble before they walk. They're supposed to make mistakes, learn from failures, and slowly accumulate knowledge across generations. We can trace this pattern everywhere we look in the ancient world. In Egypt, simple reed shelters gradually became mud brick houses, which eventually became stone temples. In China, basic pottery slowly evolved into sophisticated bronze work over centuries of experimentation. In Mesoamerica, agriculture developed through trial and error before cities could emerge. This is how human progress works, slowly, incrementally, with each generation building slightly higher on the foundation laid by their ancestors. But Sumer doesn't follow this pattern. Sumer appears complete when archaeologists excavate the earliest substantial Sumerian layers. They don't find primitive beginnings. They find sophistication, mathematics that still governs how we measure time, astronomy accurate enough to predict celestial events, medicine that actually works, legal systems nuanced enough to handle complex disputes, architecture aligned to cosmic precision, all of it present from the start, all of it to advance, to have been invented recently. Take their mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60-number system, the same system we still use today when we divide hours into 60 minutes or circles into 360 degrees. This isn't a simple counting system. It's an elegant mathematical framework where 60 can be evenly divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes calculations for trade, construction, and astronomy remarkably efficient. But base 60 doesn't emerge naturally. Most cultures count on their fingers and develop base 10 systems. A few use base 20, counting fingers and toes. Base 60 requires someone to recognize its mathematical advantages and then convince an entire civilization to adopt it as standard. The Sumerians have no earlier tablets showing experimentation with different number bases, no evidence of competing systems tried and abandoned. Base 60 is simply there in the earliest mathematical texts, already embedded in everything they calculate, already taught to children in scribal schools, and the mathematics itself is advanced. Clay tablets from Nippur contain multiplication tables extending into the thousands, division problems using fractions, calculations for compound interest, geometric formulas for measuring irregular field areas. One tablet shows an approximation of the square root of 2, calculated to 6 decimal places. This level of precision supposedly wasn't achieved again until Greek mathematicians worked on irrational numbers 2,000 years later, yet there it is, scratched into clay by a Sumerian student copying from an older exemplar, treating advanced mathematics as routine classroom exercise. Their astronomy shows the same impossible sophistication. The Sumerians tracked Venus with obsessive precision, recording when it appeared in the eastern sky before dawn, when it vanished behind the sun, when it emerged in the western sky after sunset. These observations, preserved on tablets that were copied and recopied across centuries, are accurate to within a single day across 21-year cycles. You cannot achieve that precision through casual sky watching. You need continuous observation maintained across generations. You need instruments for measuring positions. You need mathematical systems for recording data. You need institutions where knowledge accumulates rather than being lost when individual observers die. The Sumerians had all of this. From their earliest period, their medical knowledge is equally startling. Clay tablets listing remedies and treatments don't read like early experiments in healing. They read like reference manuals compiled from established practice. Thyme for respiratory infections, willow bark for pain, which modern medicine confirmed contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, fermented grain mixtures for digestive ailments. The texts specify dosages, preparation methods, and expected outcomes with clinical precision. These remedies work. Modern pharmacology has verified that many Sumerian medicines contain biologically active compounds effective for their stated purposes. But this knowledge doesn't emerge overnight. It requires generations of careful observation. Which plants help, which harm, in what combinations, at what doses. The Sumerian medical corpus appears fully formed in its earliest attestations, as if documenting a tradition that was already ancient. Their metallurgy tells the same story. By 3,000 years before the Common Era, Sumerian smiths were producing bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that requires precise temperature control and careful ratio management. Too much tin makes the metal brittle. Too little and it doesn't harden properly. The optimal ratio is roughly 88% copper to 12% tin. Sumerian bronze consistently hits this ratio. The earliest bronze artifacts show professional quality metal. tools with proper temper, weapons with effective edges, decorative objects with sophisticated craftsmanship. No phase of failed experiments is preserved in the archaeological record. No brittle swords that shattered on first use. No soft tools that bent instead of cutting. They knew the formula. From the beginning, even their legal codes suggest inheritance rather than invention. The earliest Sumerian law collections contain complex laws distinguishing between premeditated and accidental harm, statutes governing property disputes and inheritance rights, regulations for commercial contracts and debt management. Legal systems this nuanced typically evolve through case law. Real disputes reveal gaps in existing rules. Edge cases force refinement. But Sumerian law appears comprehensive immediately, as if the framers already anticipated the full spectrum of human conflict. Their writing system follows the same pattern. When cuneiform first appears in the archaeological record, it already contains approximately 700 distinct symbols, not pictographs that gradually abstract into writing, but a hybrid system combining logograms, symbols representing whole words, with phonetic elements, symbols representing sounds. This kind of sophisticated writing usually takes centuries to evolve, but there are no awkward proto-cuneiform tablets where scribes are still figuring out how to represent complex ideas. The system appears standardized, as if someone taught it rather than invented it. And then there's their architecture. The great ziggurats, those stepped pyramids that dominated Sumerian cities, weren't just religious monuments. They were astronomically aligned. The ziggurat at Ur, reconstructed around 2100 years before the Common Era but built on much older foundations, aligns its corners to the cardinal directions with less than 1 degree of error. Its stairways face the summer solstice sunrise. Achieving this precision requires understanding the relationship between celestial motion and earthly orientation, knowledge of the ecliptic, the celestial equator, the annual movement of the sun relative to the horizon. It requires instruments for measuring angles and patience for tracking solar positions across seasons. The Sumerians had both. Their constellation lists, catalogues of star groupings used for timekeeping and agricultural planning, are still partially recognizable today. They marked celestial coordinates that helped farmers know when to plant and travelers know which direction to sail. Running through all of this, through their mathematical texts and astronomical tables and medical prescriptions and legal formulas, is a phrase that appears over and over. From distant days, not we invented this, not our teachers discovered this, but from distant days, a passive construction that places the origin outside living memory. In a scribal school text from Nippur, a teacher instructs students. From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced. The words of the ancestors must be preserved. Preserved, not created. Preserved, the Sumerians consistently present themselves not as inventors, but as custodians, caretakers of knowledge that came from somewhere else, from some time earlier, from people whose names had already been lost. They were restoring what the flood had interrupted, rebuilding on top of ruins, both physical and intellectual. The 8 feet of sterile clay at Ur represents a break in continuity, but not total annihilation. Some knowledge survived, carried by refugees who fled to higher ground, passed through oral tradition, encoded in practices whose origins no one remembered but everyone maintained. But this raises the question that changes everything. If the Sumerians inherited their sophistication from the world before the flood, who established that knowledge in the first place? Who were the ancestors they kept referencing? Who were the teachers from distant days? The king list might give us the answer. Not in the impossible lifespans, which we now understand as astronomical cycles, but in the names themselves, Alulam, Alalga, and Menluana, names that the Sumerians preserved with reverence, copying them faithfully across 1,000 years. What if those weren't the names of individual kings at all? What if they were names of eras, periods of time labeled by survivors trying to organize fragments of a shattered past? And if they were eras, what happened during them that was worth remembering across catastrophe? What knowledge was established in those impossibly distant days before the waters swept over and kingship had to be lowered from heaven again? Let's return to those 8 impossible kings, the ones who supposedly ruled Eridu for a combined 241,000 years before the flood swept over and everything changed. We've established that their reign lengths aren't measuring human lifespans. They're measuring something else. Astronomical cycles, institutional operation periods, Shahs counted across timescales that dwarf individual human experience. But what about the names themselves? Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Dumusidi, shepherd, Ensapad Sidana, Enmendurana, Uba Tutu. We've been calling them kings because that's what the document calls them, because kingship descended from heaven and these figures are listed in a king list. But what if that's a mistranslation of function? What if these weren't individual rulers at all, but labels for errors? Names given to periods of time by people trying to organize fragments of a chronology that had been shattered by catastrophe. Think about how we name historical periods: the Victorian era, the Bronze Age, the Renaissance. We're not talking about individual people, even when the era carries someone's name. We're talking about spans of time characterized by particular developments, particular cultural features, particular ways of organizing society. What if the Alulam period simply means the first era of organized astronomical observation at Eridu? 8 Shahs, 28,800 years. The founding period when skywatching became institutionalized, when someone first began keeping continuous records, when the system that would run for 241,000 years was established. N-men-lu, whose name means something like Lord of the Divine Powers of Heaven, might not be a person. It might be the era when celestial observation reached a particular level of sophistication. 12 Shahs, 43,200 years. Perhaps this was when eclipse prediction became reliable, when the movements of planets were first accurately charted, when the precession of the equinoxes was first recognized. This reading transforms the king list from impossible biography into plausible chronology. Not a record of superhuman individuals, but a record of institutional continuity. The document isn't saying Alulam, the man lived for 28,800 years. It's saying the Alulam period, the era of the Eridu observatories, founding and early operation, encompassed 8 complete Shah cycles before transitioning into the next phase. And here's what makes this interpretation compelling. The Sumerians themselves referenced these names as historical precedents, not as mythological figures, not as symbolic ancestors, as actual periods of time when particular wisdom was established in legal formulas carved into stone boundary markers. You find phrases like this: according to the justice that was established in the days of Alulam, not in the time of the gods, not in a mythological golden age, in the days of Alulam, as though this were a real historical period whose legal principles were still being referenced and applied thousands of years later. Temple inscriptions mention the wisdom that was revealed in the time of Enma. Agricultural texts describe planting cycles that were first recognized during the era of Enmangalana. These aren't casual mythological allusions, they're citations, references to specific historical periods treated with the same seriousness that a modern legal document might reference the Constitutional Convention or the Magna Carta. Sumerians acted as though these periods were real, as though wisdom established during those eras carried authority, as though knowledge from the time before the flood could be invoked as precedent for decisions made in the present. This explains why later scribes copied the king lists with such reverence. They weren't preserving mythology, they were preserving institutional history. The chronology of when astronomical observation began, how long it continued, what phases it passed through, and when catastrophe ended it. When a Babylonian scribe in the 18th century, before the Common Era, sat down to copy the king list from an older Sumerian version, they weren't recording fantasy. They were transmitting the operational history of the oldest scientific institution anyone knew about. An observatory system that had run for 241,000 years before the flood destroyed it. The numbers had to be preserved exactly because they documented something real, not individual human lifespans, which would be obviously impossible, but institutional lifespans, which were merely ancient beyond reckoning. So, if we read the king list this way, as a record of how long astronomical observation operated at various Sumerian cities before the flood, then the document becomes evidence of something extraordinary. A civilization sophisticated enough to maintain continuous scientific observation across timescales that make Egyptian dynasties look like brief moments. But this immediately raises the question we've been circling since the beginning. Who founded these institutions? Who established the Eridu Observatory in the first place? Who began the count that would eventually accumulate to 8 shahs, 10 shahs, 12 shahs, before the waters came and swept it all away? The Sumerians had an answer. They wrote it down in thousands of tablets. They carved it into temple walls. They wove it through hymns and prayers and creation myths. They never stopped talking about who taught them, who gave them knowledge, who established the foundations of civilization that the Sumerians were desperately trying to restore after the flood. They called them the Anunnaki. The name appears everywhere in Sumerian literature. The great gods who decree fate, the divine assembly who judge humanity, the ones who came from heaven to establish order on earth. Modern readers dismiss them as mythology, as primitive people inventing gods to explain natural phenomena. But the Sumerians never described the Anunnaki as distant cosmic forces. They described them as active participants, teachers, instructors, beings who walked among humans, and showed them how to measure the stars in creation myths. The Anunnaki don't speak the world into existence. They work, they dig canals, they build temples, they organize agriculture, and when they grow tired of the labor, they create humans to help maintain what they've established. Not through divine miracle, but through a process the texts describe with procedural detail. Mixing, testing, adjusting, trial and error. These stories read less like theology and more like documentation, as though the Sumerians were trying to preserve memory of actual events using the only vocabulary available to them, the vocabulary of gods and divine action, because they had no other framework for describing beings who possessed knowledge far beyond what human civilization had yet achieved. What if the Anunnaki weren't mythological at all? What if they were the survivors of the pre-flood world? The ones who established the observatories that ran for 241,000 years. The ones who developed base 60 mathematics and bronze metallurgy and sophisticated medicine. The ones who built the civilization that the 8 feet of sterile clay at your buried and partially destroyed. And what if, after the waters receded, after the observatories were ruined and the continuous chain of observation was broken, those survivors taught the next generation what they could remember, passed down fragments of knowledge, established new schools and temples and scribal traditions, tried to restore what had been lost over generations as memory faded and distance grew. Those teachers would have been elevated, mythologized, transformed from human survivors with advanced knowledge into divine beings with cosmic authority. Their teachings would have become sacred wisdom. Their names would have become invocations. The people who established the Ululan period would have become the gods who lowered kingship from heaven. This is how ancestor worship works. This is how founders become legends. But underneath the mythology, fragments of historical truth can persist. Names, practices, knowledge, technologies that get attributed to divine gift because no one can remember where they actually came from. The Sumerians might have been doing exactly this, preserving memory of their teachers in the only format that could survive across catastrophe. Myth. And if that's true, then the king list becomes something even more remarkable than a chronology of astronomical observation. It becomes a memorial, a monument in clay to a civilization that existed before the flood, to the institutions they established, to the knowledge they accumulated, to the teachers who survived just long enough to pass fragments forward to descendants who would spend thousands of years trying to restore what the waters had taken away. In the darkness of museum archives, those names wait: Alalim, Enmanluana, Ubartutu, pressed into clay by scribes who believed they were preserving something that mattered, something true. Were they right? Were these the names of eras when knowledge flowed freely, when observatories tracked the heavens, when the Anunnaki walked among humans and taught them to measure time in shars? The clay tablets can't tell us definitively, but they whisper, they hint, they preserve just enough to make us question everything we thought we knew about how long human civilization has really existed. If you walk through the ancient Near East galleries of any major museum, you'll eventually come across cylinder seals, small stone cylinders carved with intricate scenes that, when rolled across wet clay, leave perfect impressions. Tax receipts used them. Property deeds used them. Personal letters used them. They were the signatures of the ancient world, and on many of these seals, you'll see the same figures appearing over and over. 7 seated forms arranged in formal hierarchy, robed, bearded, holding symbols of authority, and above them, pressed into the clay in tiny wedge-shaped marks, a single identifying phrase. The Anu, the great gods who decree fate. They appear in thousands of Sumerian texts, not as abstract cosmic forces, but as active participants in the daily operation of the world. They have names, genealogies, specific responsibilities. They argue with each other, form alliances, compete for influence, make decisions that sometimes turn out to be catastrophic mistakes. They're portrayed as powerful, yes, but not omnipotent, not distant, not unknowable. They're embedded in the world, subject to consequence and limitation in ways that make them feel less like theological abstractions and more like something else. something the Sumerians remembered but could only describe using the vocabulary of divinity. The creation myths tell their story with unusual honesty. In the Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets from the 18th century before the Common Era but copied from much older Sumerian sources, the Anunnaki aren't creating the world from nothing. They're maintaining it, digging irrigation channels, dredging rivers, building temples, and after 3,600 years, one complete Shah cycle, they're exhausted. The younger gods revolt. They burn their tools. They march on the divine assembly and demand relief. They need workers, but they can't force immortal beings to labor forever. So Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, proposes creating humans, not through divine word or cosmic breath, but through a process. The goddess Nintu mixes clay with divine essence. She shapes forms. She creates the first beings, but they're defective. One cannot control bodily functions. Another cannot speak clearly. A third has impaired vision. The texts describe this with clinical detail. Attempt, defect, adjustment, next attempt. Eventually the process stabilizes. Functional humans capable of reproduction and labor. But notice the language. The myths don't describe instantaneous perfection. They describe trial and error, experimentation, the procedural steps of someone who understands they're working toward a goal and encountering obstacles along the way. This isn't how gods typically create in ancient mythology. Egyptian gods speak and reality obeys. Greek gods form humans perfectly from the start. But Sumerian creation accounts include failure, which makes them sound less like theology and more like documentation. And throughout these stories, the Anunnaki aren't performing miracles. They're teaching. Enki shows humans how to dig canals, how to manage water flow, how to prevent fields from becoming waterlogged or salinized. Enlil organizes agricultural cycles, establishing when to plant and when to harvest based on seasonal patterns. Inanna charts the movements of Venus, teaching the correlation between celestial positions and earthly time. These aren't divine mysteries. They're practical skills. The kind of knowledge that requires observation, experimentation, and accumulated wisdom. The kind of knowledge that the Sumerians possessed from their earliest layers, but never claimed to have invented. They claimed it was given, taught by the Anunnaki. Now here's where the story becomes stranger. These teacher figures who descend from the heavens to instruct humanity don't appear only in Sumerian texts. They appear everywhere, across cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, with different names but remarkably similar functions. In Egypt, the Neteru, often translated as gods, are described in temple inscriptions as teachers who arrived in pre-dynastic times to establish law, agriculture, and astronomy. Like the Anunnaki, they're shown with human characteristics, engaging in recognizably human activities, interacting directly with early Egyptians to pass down essential knowledge. In Hindu tradition, the Devas, celestial beings who shape reality, descend periodically to instruct humanity during transitions between cosmic ages. They teach sacred knowledge, establish cosmic law, guide civilization through cycles of creation and destruction. They occupy an intermediate status, neither fully divine nor fully mortal, in despite having no contact with Mesopotamia or Egypt or India. Cultures describe sky teachers who descended to instruct humanity after previous worlds were destroyed. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, brings writing, mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture. the same portfolio attributed to Enki in Sumerian texts. In Greek mythology, the Titans, primordial beings who ruled before the Olympian gods, taught humans fire, metalwork, agriculture, and law. Prometheus defies Zeus to give humanity knowledge, suffering eternal punishment for bridging the gap between divine understanding and mortal ignorance. Early Jewish texts, written long after Sumerian civilization fell, mention the Watchers, angels who descended to earth, intermarried with humans, and taught forbidden knowledge, metalworking, cosmetics, astrology, warfare. The Book of Enoch describes them explicitly as teachers providing humanity with skills that accelerated civilization, independent. Invention should produce more variation. If every culture spontaneously generated teacher-from-the-sky myths, we'd expect wildly different details. Some would be animals, some would be tricksters, some wouldn't teach at all. Instead, the pattern holds. Anthropomorphic figures with knowledge arrive from elsewhere. They interact with humanity. They provide the foundational skills that enable civilization. Then they either depart or are removed by catastrophe or divine intervention, leaving humans to continue alone with the fragments they've been given. This consistency across unrelated cultures suggests something deeper than coincidence. Either these stories all descend from a single ancestral myth that spread impossibly far and survived impossibly long, or they're all preserving memory of something that actually happened, something significant enough that every culture that experienced it felt compelled to remember it, even as the specifics blurred and the teachers themselves were elevated from human to divine. The Sumerians might have been closest to the source, closest to the original event, which is why their accounts retain details that feel almost procedural, why their creation myths include trial and error, why their teachers have specific names and specific functions rather than vague, cosmic attributes. If the Anunnaki were survivors of the pre-flood world, people who possessed knowledge accumulated over the 241,000 years that the observatories operated, then, after the catastrophe, they would have been the only ones who remembered, the only ones who understood base 60 mathematics and astronomical cycles and bronze metallurgy and agricultural management. They would have taught the next generation, established new schools, founded new temples, tried to restore what the flood had destroyed. And over time, as generations passed and the distance grew between the teachers and their descendants, those teachers would have been remembered as gods because their knowledge seemed divine compared to what the survivors possessed. This is how ancestor worship works everywhere. Founders become legends, teachers become divinities, but underneath the mythology, fragments of truth persist. The knowledge itself survives, even when memory of where it came from grows hazy. The Sumerians were trying to preserve that memory. When they wrote about the Anunnaki teaching humans to measure the stars, they weren't inventing theology. They were documenting inheritance. When they described knowledge being given rather than discovered, they were being precise. It was given by teachers who survived from before, teachers who measured time in shars, because that's how their civilization, the one buried beneath 8 feet of flood silt, had always measured cosmic cycles. The king list preserves the chronology. The creation myths preserve the process. And running through everything is the memory of teachers whose knowledge was so far beyond what came after that the only way to describe them was as divine, but they weren't gods. They were survivors, the last inheritors of a world that ended in water. And when they taught the Sumerians to watch the sky, to track Venus, to calculate in base 60, To mix bronze with precise ratios, they were passing forward everything they could remember from the institutions that had operated for 241,000 years before the flood swept over in the quiet darkness where you're listening now. Imagine those teachers standing among ruins, looking up at stars that still followed the patterns their observatories had tracked for countless shahs, knowing they were the last who remembered, knowing they had to pass something forward or it would all be lost. They taught what they could. The Sumerians learned, copied, preserved, and pressed the memory into clay where it would wait, hard and permanent, for 5,000 years, until we would finally start to understand what we were reading, somewhere in a climate-controlled archive. In the darkness between closing time and dawn, the clay tablets rest, cool, silent, waiting, each one a message pressed into wet earth, by hands that understood they were preserving something that mattered, something that had to survive them. If you could hold one of those king list tablets right now, if you were allowed to lift it carefully from its archival foam and feel the weight of ancient clay in your hands, you would see them, the fingerprints, not yours, the scribes, pressed into the surface 4,000 years ago before the tablet was fired, before it hardened into the permanent record it became. Those ridges and whorls belonged to someone who sat in a temple scriptorium, reed stylus in hand, copying impossible numbers from an even older version. 28,800 years, 43,200 years. Numbers that made no sense as human lifespans, but that had to be preserved exactly, had to be transmitted faithfully, because they documented something real. That scribe was reaching across time, building a bridge between the world before the flood and whatever future might eventually learn to read what had been saved. And now, 5,000 years after the Sumerians first pressed these numbers into clay, we're finally beginning to understand what they were trying to tell us. Let's gather the threads we've followed. Let's see what picture emerges when we lay them side by side. First, the numbers themselves. Impossible as human lifespans, but perfectly precise as astronomical calculations. Every pre-flood rain length is a multiple of 3,600. Every one, not random exaggeration, not poetic mythology, but mathematical encoding. Shahs, the Sumerian unit for measuring vast cosmic cycles. 8 shahs, 10 shahs, 12 shahs. Count so long they dwarf individual human experience, but make sense as institutional lifespans, as the operational periods of observatories tracking celestial patterns across timescales. We can barely imagine second, the flood. Not mythology, but geology. 8 feet of sterile clay deposited between occupation layers at Ur, the same pattern at at Kish, at Eridu, around 2,900 years before the Common Era. Water came, sudden, catastrophic, total within the boundaries of the Mesopotamian world. The king list divides history at precisely this moment. Before the flood, impossible numbers measured in after the flood, human scale reigns. Because after the catastrophe, the institutions that had operated for 241,000 years were gone, and survivors had to rebuild from fragments. Third, the knowledge, mathematics that appears complete, astronomy accurate too within a day, medicine that actually works, bronze alloys mixed perfectly from the start, legal codes sophisticated enough to handle complex disputes, writing systems containing 700 symbols with no prototype, all of it present in the earliest Sumerian layers, all of it too advanced to have been recently invented, all of it described by the Sumerians themselves as inherited. as restored, as passed down from distant days by teachers whose names they preserved but whose origins they could no longer clearly remember. Fourth, the language. Sumerian stands alone. No relatives, no linguistic family. An isolate that appeared in writing and then died, leaving no descendants. The kind of isolation that happens when catastrophe severs a language from its broader family. When the speakers of related dialects are killed or scattered by disaster, leaving only one branch to survive in fragmentary form, carried forward by people rebuilding on top of ruins. Fifth, the teachers. The Anunnaki in Sumerian texts, the Neteru in Egyptian inscriptions, the Devas in Hindu tradition, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Prometheus among the Greeks, the Watchers in Hebrew texts, different names across cultures that had no contact with each other, but the same function. Beings who descended from elsewhere to teach humanity the foundations of civilization, agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, law, not distant cosmic forces, but active instructors who walked among humans and passed down knowledge before departing or being removed by catastrophe. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss. These stories either all descend from a single ancestral memory that spread impossibly far, or they're all preserving fragments of something that actually happened. Something significant enough that every culture felt compelled to remember it, even as the details blurred and the teachers themselves were elevated from survivors into gods. Sixth, the names in the king list. Alulam, Enmenluana, Uba Tutu, not individual kings, but eras. Periods of time when particular phases of astronomical observation were active. The Alulam period, 8 Shahs, the founding era when skywatching became institutionalized, and Menluana, 12 Shahs, perhaps when eclipse prediction became reliable, each name marking a phase in the continuous operation of institutions that would run until the waters came and swept everything away. When you gather all of this, when you lay the evidence side by side, a picture emerges that the Sumerians never stopped trying to show us. They weren't recording the beginning of civilization. They were recording its restoration. They weren't inventing knowledge. They were inheriting it from survivors of a world that had ended in catastrophe. A world sophisticated enough to maintain astronomical observation for periods measured in hundreds of thousands of years. A world whose institutions the Sumerians spent millennia trying to rebuild, one tablet at a time, one calculation at a time, one transmitted lesson at a time. So did the first kings live for tens of thousands of years. No human lives that long, but the institutions they founded did. The observatories that bore their names operated for spans of time so vast that even the Sumerians, 5,000 years in our past, could only record them as numbers that seemed impossible. Numbers they copied faithfully because they understood those figures documented something real, even if they could no longer fully comprehend what. The king list isn't mythology dressed as history. It's institutional chronology dressed in the language of kingship because that was the only vocabulary available. It's a memorial to a world that existed before the flood, to the knowledge that world accumulated, to the teachers who survived just long enough to pass fragments forward, and to the Sumerians who spent thousands of years trying to restore what the waters had taken away, in the ruins of Mesopotamia, where the wind still moves across broken ziggurat platforms and collapsed temple walls. You can almost hear it. The whisper of memory, the echo of voices that knew they were preserving something precious, something that had to survive. They pressed their testimony into wet clay. They fired it hard and permanent. They copied it across generations, even when the meaning grew hazy, even when the context was lost, because they believed it mattered. They believed future generations might eventually understand what they were trying to save. Were they right? Are we finally listening? The clay remembers what we forgot. That human civilization is older than we think. That knowledge can survive catastrophe if someone cares enough to preserve it. That the impossible numbers pressed into ancient tablets might not be fantasy at all, but the last surviving record of institutions that watched the sky for longer than we've been watching anything. Somewhere in the darkness, those fingerprints wait, reaching across 5,000 years, bridging the gap between the scribe who pressed them into clay and you, listening now in whatever quiet corner of the world has brought you to this story. They were trying to tell us something about who we are, about where we came from, about how much was lost when the waters swept over in kingship had to be lowered from heaven again. Maybe it's time we started listening. Maybe it's time we read those impossible numbers not as mistakes, but as messages. Not as mythology, but as memory. The last testimony of a world that ended, preserved by people who understood they were the final generation that remembered. The clay is patient. The tablets wait. And the story they tell, if we're willing to hear it, is far older and far stranger than anything we thought we knew about the first kings who reigned in distant days, before the flood. When time was measured in shars and the sky watchers counted cycles, we're only now beginning to understand. Sleep now, and let the clay remember for you.